Welcome to the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS. I'm Anna Mapson. Today's episode is really going to be focusing on the link between the gut and the brain, how we feel and how that might influence our digestion, but also how issues in your digestion can really influence your mood and worsen anxiety and depression and other mood disorders. I posted something to Instagram last week, which was focused on a new study that had come out, which tracked people over 7 years and looked to answer the question, does IBS cause mood issues or do mood issues cause IBS? It was a really interesting study because they had two groups of people and they were large groups as well. So it's not just a small study. But looking at them over 7 years, were people with mood disorders such as generalized anxiety disorder, depression, were they more likely to get IBS throughout those 7 years? And then they did the opposite as well. So people who had IBS but had no mood issues, were they more likely to develop mood problems compared to a control group? So both sets of people had a control group. I'll put a link in the show notes for anybody who wants to go and have a look at this study in a bit more detail. But I will go through and explain a bit more about it in this episode, so you don't have to do that research yourself. I like basing my episodes around the new science for IBS because there's so much coming out that we can use to help change, how I work with you, how I can give you advice. And I like to keep on top of all of that research. And it's an area where there is a lot of research, about gut health and IBS. And so it's helpful. But the other reason I wanted to talk about this particular topic is some people I work with have ongoing anxieties or recurrent low mood. And I find that people might feel a little bit guilty about it almost, like they almost feel like their digestive issues shouldn't be getting them down to the extent that they do, or shouldn't be making them as worried. But from the kinds of things that people tell me that they're having to live with day to day, it makes a lot of sense that you don't feel good. Because if you are restricting your diet, so you're eating quite boring food every day, you're restricting your activities, so you're maybe not socializing with people as much, you're not going for as many opportunities as you could, for example, like work travel, you might decide not to go and try to just do things via Zoom or work from home because you're worried about your gut symptoms being with other people. So you're kind of restricting yourself and not experiencing things as much. Like all of those things are going to have a massive impact on your mood. Plus, there is always the ongoing worry with most people that I work with that it's actually not IBS, that it's something else triggering your symptoms. And so until you've got a handle on feeling better, it's kind of natural that you feel a bit scared, worried, you can't sleep well because of all the sort of thoughts. And it can create a really negative feedback loop. Thinking about food restriction particularly, we know that the more restriction people put in place on their diet, the more rigid their thinking patterns can be and become more black and white thinking, like it's all or nothing. I have to be completely controlled and careful, or I might just blow it and actually just eat anything I want. Or maybe people are thinking a bit more catastrophically about things, oh, I feel a little gurgle. And then they're catastrophizing and thinking really negative thoughts. Oh, this means I won't be able to go out at the weekend. That means I'm never going to find a boyfriend. Just leading on to things that simply aren't true, but feel very real in the moment because of course, we can't predict the future. So that's part of the reason I wanted to bring this science into it, I suppose, about some of the mechanisms by which the brain and the gut are connected, and then also show you how linked they are. So if you're in that place where you're feeling really fed up, maybe a little bit trapped by your digestion and you don't know what to do, you're definitely not alone, and it's definitely not your fault because there are some of these really difficult circumstances that you are having to live with. This was a study based in Taiwan, and they used around 30,000 people, I think maybe just over that, for each of the groups, like the ones that went from IBS to psychological distress and the ones that had mental health conditions and then developed IBS. But so they took the people who had a mental health condition, something like anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, generalized anxiety, panic disorders, post-traumatic stress, anxiety, low mood. So they had a diagnosed psychological condition that they were being treated for, and they ruled out anybody who had IBS or any kind of gut health issues. So that was at the beginning. And then over the course of 7 years, 8.1% of people developed IBS, which was compared to only 5% in the control group. So the people who didn't have psychological issues. This, if we look at it in terms of relative risk, is a 55% higher risk of developing IBS if you start out with post-traumatic stress disorder, you've had depression that's not well managed. There's a likelihood that's been proven here. And I think that's something we see. But it's quite good to see these figures. Now, the other way around is also quite interesting. So people who had IBS, who didn't have any mental health issues, over the course of the 7 years, 12% developed a mental health kind of disorder or condition, compared to 8.1% of the control group who didn't go on to develop anything, didn't have IBS, but were also monitored. That is a 46% higher chance of developing anxiety or depression later in life if you have IBS that is not well managed. So I think the key message coming out of this is that we can see either one, whether you start off with mental health worries, you have more of a chance than people who don't of developing IBS. And the same the other way around. It is a two-way relationship. The gut-brain connection is very clear. So let's think about what else was found in that study. And then I want to think about why some of these connections might have been there. So one really interesting point, which I want to draw out, is that sleep problems were the highest moderator of the results. So people who had anxiety or depression and didn't sleep had the highest risk of getting IBS. And the same with people who had IBS and sleep issues had the highest risk of developing mental health issues. So we've got the connection between sleep and then how it plays out into gut and into mood. So we know that when you don't sleep well, you feel more anxiety, you feel more pain. So sensitivity in the gut, pain from trapped gas or constipation or nerve sensitivity will be increased. That is a known factor. Plus, when you're tired, you tend to make different food choices. Like you want to go for foods that are going to help you get a quick burst of energy. Maybe they're not, they're foods that, don't have high levels of the protein and like fiber that you might normally go for because you're tired and you just want something quick and easy. All right, so there's a behavioral knock-on impact, but also we know that when you're tired, your cortisol levels might be a little bit higher. And that is a kind of evolutionary protective mechanism, I suppose. Like if in Neanderthal times we weren't sleeping well, and we were on a high alert, the body's like ready to go, ready for some danger. And that in itself can then have signaling changes in the way the immune system works, which may change some inflammatory markers. So sleep was definitely pulled out in this study over 7 years, that if you don't sleep well consistently, there may be a knock-on impact. You can listen to episode 59 for more details about sleep, where I recorded that episode about how to get the best sleep, sleep hygiene, things like that. The other interesting points that they pulled out, which maybe again is not so surprising, is that the associations between mental health conditions and gut health conditions were strongest in women. Women are twice as likely to have IBS than men. We know that, especially constipation types, maybe down to the hormonal connection. And so hormones can modulate your bile production, for example, which then affects how you break down fats. Bile is antimicrobial. If that is sludgy, it can really happen in perimenopause. that exacerbates your digestive issues. Hormones can also affect serotonin secretion. So that controls your gut motility. If you have very high levels of serotonin, sometimes you're getting diarrhea, loose stools. Very low levels, maybe it's slowing down and becoming a bit more constipated. So hormones change your gut motility and the function of the gut, but also the chemicals that are helping you break down your food. And when you have hormonal fluctuations, sometimes there are like unbalanced, like very strong estrogen peaks, for example, or estrogen that's not balanced by progesterone. Those kind of things can also drive changes to our gut, but clearly changes to the mood as well. Most people who have a menstrual cycle will have experienced some of that before you get your period, feeling very irritable, moody, and maybe tearful, angry, any of those things. So that's a little bit more nuance. The other strongest links were in slightly younger people, which is maybe a bit interesting. I tend to see people who are slightly older, and maybe that's just people who I attract. Women who are like 40 plus, I tend to work with, although not always. And in this study, it was women who were under 40 who had the strongest correlation between anxiety and depression and IBS. The other bit to pull out of this was that anxiety was more common as a mental health risk factor than depression. And this also tends to fit with the picture of that hypervigilance, being worried about what might be happening, thinking about threats to you. Basically, every time you eat, it feels like there's a threat. Something could be upsetting your digestion. So that in itself is then creating further physical changes to the gut. That fight, flight, freeze response becomes even more heightened, which then changes your gut motility, changes the blood flow to the gut. So again, there's like this feedback loop. The sorts of ways that the gut and the brain affect each other, because I've mentioned the gut-brain connection, like what actually is that? Well, it includes various mechanisms by which the brain and the gut are in communication. So firstly, there is the vagus nerve. This is a physical nerve that runs from the base of your brain down your spine and out into all the digestive organs in the torso. So it's wrapped around your kidneys, your intestines, your stomach, your liver. All of these are sending messages back to the brain. There's a real two-way physical connection between the nerves that are sensing what's going on and sending messages back to the brain about the health of the body, the nutrient status, the function of the gut. So there's that as one way that the brain and gut communicate. The second way that they're communicating is through hormones and messages that are being sent in the blood, messages that are being sent between cells. Now, this could include things like serotonin that I mentioned before, which affects your gut motility. And a lot of people think about serotonin that's made in the gut and that it can affect your mood, but we think that it's probably separate types of serotonin. So serotonin made in the gut controls gut motility. Serotonin for the brain and the nervous system is probably a bit different and made in the brain. So it doesn't mean if you have low levels of serotonin production in the gut that you necessarily will develop a mood disorder. They're kind of separate, but certainly there is messages about neurotransmitters. GABA production, that's another one of our calming kind of neurotransmitters. These are really communicating between the brain, and it's not just the brain sending messages back down. Some of these are made in the digestive system and sent back up. And then the third way that the brain and gut communicating all the time is via the gut bacteria and the products that they are making. So, for example, when you eat some things with fiber in it, your gut bacteria are making short-chain fatty acids, and these circulate around the body. They can get into the brain, and they're helpful anti-inflammatory compounds that our body likes to have. And so that's one way that the messages are coming from the gut back to the brain. But we're also the levels of gut bacteria are being sensed by the body, and we're sent messages back to the brain about the health of the gut based on, is there an infection? Is there something there that needs controlling? In which case the immune system is sent in. So the immune system and its inflammation markers and the gut bacteria are all in connection. That's how your nervous system and your brain can be influencing your gut as well. Your digestive system could be affecting your mood through processing of nutrients. If you're not having adequate intake of nutrients, that may be affecting production of certain neurotransmitters, of your energy levels, your blood. Because if you haven't got the right nutrients coming in, that can have a negative influence on the rest of the body, make you feel quite tired, emotional as well. If you have blood sugar dips, you're not feeding yourself properly, you may have times where you feel a bit on edge because you are hungry. So we can definitely have a connection from the gut back to the brain. And then obviously like how we feel, and the brain is also sending messages back down. There may even be a genetic component to this as well, that some genes that are controlling inflammation markers, controlling pain sensitivity, maybe controlling our serotonin production, these could be influencing both processes in the brain and in the gut as well. So you may be genetically predisposed to either one of those conditions. And I think what's interesting now is thinking about the broader link between them, that one gene doesn't just control, say, stomach acid production, but it could also be linked to other conditions and other changes. And I think we will learn more about genetic consequences of that through time. Now, for you, if you're listening to this thinking, yeah, well, I have got both of those, and what does it actually mean? Because knowing this, knowing I'm not alone is okay, but it's not going to help me right now. I think one aspect I would like to pull out is that treating IBS with just your diet is rarely effective. And that is why I use my gut reset Cogs model. Go and have a look at that episode if you want to see a bit more about how I work. But I focus on your eating practices, which includes meal regularity, how you're eating and all of that, but also your gut health. So what's happening with the microbes, what's your digestion processes like. Then also thinking about lifestyle, like sleep, stress, mood, what can you do to try and improve all of those things. And then also food. Obviously that is a key part of it, because food reactions is where you're noticing your changes or improvements or symptoms. What I find people home in on is, oh, I've got SIBO, I just need to kill the bacteria, I need to get that done and then everything will be fine. No, it doesn't work like that. You normally need to rejig your whole approach to eating in order to be able to eat a better diet, to be less stressed, to stop eating, standing up in the kitchen, throwing food in your face. Maybe you need to do some exercise. It could be much broader than just changing your eating. And if you just focus in terms of mental health, just focusing on your mood, maybe you're doing some nice things like journaling, talking therapy. Again, amazing, so good for your whole body health. If you're not changing your diet, you're hardly eating, you're not doing any exercise, like none of those things in isolation will help, but together they're really powerful. And that is why I pull all of that together when I work with people. So I guess my plea to you, if you're listening to this, is to try and think about the basic health advice that is out there in whichever country you are. They've probably got the same health advice about getting your 5 a day, trying to increase your fiber, trying to sleep for 8 hours a night, trying to do 30 minutes of movement every day. These are good targets that most people are not achieving. And addressing IBS as well as your mental health issues will be a benefit to both parts of the equation. Now, I know that's incredibly hard when you're feeling either very low or very anxious and paralyzed with indecision, or feeling, just a bit hopeless. Plus you've got physical digestive issues, like you're on the toilet every hour or in a lot of pain. I know it's really hard, and that's why I work with my clients one-to-one, and it's quite intensive, and I try to give people a lot of support at the beginning, especially to make sure that we're making some progress. If you're looking for help with your diet, the first place I would suggest you start is my 5 non-food strategies for people with IBS. You can find a link for that in the show notes. And that is a little mini workbook you can download and try at home, which will take you through some small changes for things like movement, sleep, eating habits that could be helpful without changing your diet. And then if you want individual support, please do get in touch about working with me if you'd like to really work on your diet and digestion. If you've enjoyed this podcast or you get a lot out of it, please would you rate or review wherever you're listening? It really does help me, and I would appreciate that so much. Thank you. I'm going to leave it there for this week. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast. Better digestion for everyone.